For every iconic WWE Championship belt like the Winged Eagle, there are dozens of titles that simply vanished into thin air. Kicking things off with the title that even most hardcore wrestling fans had no idea existed, the King of the Ring Championship. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't the King of the Ring winner usually just get a crown or a robe? Well, that is the standard. But in 1995, King Mabel decided that just the title of king wasn't enough. He needed an actual physical belt. The title actually looked pretty cool, but never made it to TV. Mabel mostly wore it to conventions and independent wrestling events, and to this day, the King of the Ring title remains one of wrestling's biggest hidden gems. But speaking of forgotten championships, did you know that the WWE used to have a Canadian Heavyweight Championship? The Canadian Heavyweight Championship existed for barely 6 months, yet its history is absolutely insane. In 1985, Vince McMahon was in full expansion mode, trying to take over every wrestling territory in North America. Canada, specifically Montreal, was one of his biggest targets. The problem was that Montreal already had a massively popular wrestling promotion called International Wrestling, and their top star was a guy named Dino Bravo. This guy was their homegrown hero, and basically International Wrestling's Hulk Hogan. So when Vince couldn't outright destroy the promotion, he did something clever. As part of a co-promotion deal between WWF and International Wrestling, Dino Bravo would wrestle for the WWF while being recognized as WWF Canadian Heavyweight Champion. The belt was supposed to lead to a huge title versus title match, with Bravo's Canadian title on the line against Hulk Hogan's World Championship. This was supposed to be the big money match that would finally cement WWF's dominance in Montreal. But Vince McMahon got cold feet. When it came time for the actual show in 1986, McMahon refused to let Hogan wrestle in Canada, fearing the Hulkster would be booed. He couldn't risk his golden boy taking any kind of loss, even to protect the Canadian market. Instead, Dino wrestled Big John Studd in a completely different match that nobody cared about. Bravo was furious. He'd been promised this huge main event, and Vince had pulled the rug out from under him at the last second. He quit the WWF entirely about a week later, and the Canadian Heavyweight Championship disappeared with him. International Wrestling eventually went bankrupt less than 2 years later. Dino Bravo came back to WWF, but by then, there was no Canadian title and no mention of his past glory. But while the Canadian title was a mess, did you know that WWE had women's tag division back in the 1980s? The WWF Women's Tag Team Championships existed from 1983 all the way to 1989. The title was created during an era when WWE was still affiliated with promotions in Japan, and the belt would be defended across multiple countries, giving it international prestige. The first recognized champions were Princess Victoria and Velvet McIntyre, who won the titles in May 1983. What made these titles unique was their lineage. They technically started as NWA Women's Tag Team Championships before WWE bought the rights to the belts in 1984 and rebranded them. This gave the titles instant credibility since they weren't just created out of thin air. Throughout the mid-80s, these championships were actually featured pretty prominently, with legendary teams like the Glamour Girls and the Jumping Bomb Angels putting on some bangers. But despite this international prestige, WWE slowly lost interest in women's tag team wrestling. After the Jumping Bomb Angels and Glamour Girls had their final matches in early 1988, the titles just sort of disappeared from TV. Finally, in 1989, the company officially declared the titles abandoned without any ceremony or final match. When they brought back women's tag titles in 2019, they acted like it was this revolutionary new idea. They completely ignored the fact that women's tag championships had existed in their company 30 years earlier. The current titles have zero connection to the original lineage, which is a shame because those 1980s titles actually looked decent. But moving on from the golden era, let's talk about some obscure titles from the modern era. In 2011, Zack Ryder was stuck in jobber hell. He wasn't being used on television, wasn't winning matches, and management had basically given up on him. So Ryder started his own YouTube show called Z True Long Island Story, where he created his own storylines and feuds. And in true Ryder fashion, he created his own championship, the Internet Championship. This wasn't some fancy title. The belt looked like something you could order from a custom belt maker for a few $100. It had the old YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook logos on the side, and honestly, it looked exactly as cheesy as it sounds. But here's the shocking twist. Ryder's YouTube show became massively popular, getting hundreds of thousands of views per episode. Fans loved his underdog story and his willingness to take matters into his own hands. The Internet Championship became a symbol of Ryder's independence and creativity. WWE initially wanted nothing to do with it, but Ryder's popularity grew so large that they couldn't ignore him anymore. He started appearing on Raw, getting great crowd reactions, and eventually won the United States Championship. For a brief moment, Zack Ryder was over, and the Internet Championship was part of what got him there. However, once Ryder fell back down the card, the Internet Championship quietly disappeared. The WWF United States Tag Team Championships have such a convoluted history that even hardcore wrestling historians struggle to keep track of all the details. Back in 1958, the Capital Wrestling Corporation, which would eventually become WWE, was still part of the National Wrestling Alliance. During this era, they created the Northeast version of the NWA United States Tag Team Championships. The inaugural champions were Don Curtis and Mark Lewin, who won a tournament on July 1, 1958. Throughout the early 1960s, these titles were actually pretty significant within the territory. Wrestling legends like the Graham brothers became frequent champions and used the belts to establish themselves as one of the premier tag teams of that era. Champions would defend the belts regularly at major venues like Madison Square Garden, giving the titles prestige within the northeastern wrestling scene. However, in 1967, the titles were just suddenly deactivated. The company never acknowledged them in retrospect, never included them in historical records, and most fans today have absolutely no idea they ever existed. But if tag titles can be forgotten, you'd think singles championships would be safer, right? When most fans think of US title, they think of John Cena or MVP or JBL, but the history of the US title goes far back. The United States Heavyweight Championship is proof that even prestigious-sounding singles titles can vanish into obscurity. The championship technically began in 1960 when Nature Boy Buddy Rogers was recognized as the Northeast version of the NWA United States Heavyweight Champion. Rogers held this championship until June 1961, when he vacated it after winning the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. A wrestler named Bobo Brazil was crowned the new WWF United States Heavyweight Champion on April 6, 1963. And thus began the Bobo Brazil era of the United States Championship, which is really what this belt should be remembered for. Bobo Brazil became synonymous with this title, winning it a record 7 times throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. His biggest rival during this period was The Sheik, and their feuds over the U.S. title became legendary in the territory. After Pedro Morales won the World Heavyweight Championship in 1971, he had to vacate the United States title, and guess who was awarded the belt? That's right, Bobo Brazil. Bobo held that championship for 5 straight years, from 1971 to 1976, before the title was officially deactivated in 1976. WWE moved forward with their Intercontinental and World Championships, and the U.S. title became a footnote that nobody remembered. It would take until 2003 before the company brought back a United States Championship, and even then, they used the WCW version of the belt, rather than reviving their own forgotten title. While those classic titles faded into history over decades, some championships are forgotten almost immediately after being created. In 2018, WWE hosted the greatest Royal Rumble event in Saudi Arabia. Braun Strowman won the match and won a trophy, along with a title belt that looked like it would be perfect as the WWE Ireland Championship. But here's the problem. Nobody knew what to do with it after the show ended. It was just this random prop that Braun happened to have. Within a week, the belt completely disappeared from TV. The greatest Royal Rumble Championship existed for exactly 1 match and then vanished into the void. It's arguably the shortest-lived championship in WWE history, lasting less time than some wrestlers' entire careers. But from championships that lasted mere weeks to titles that somehow survived for 2 decades, let's talk about the strange history of the WWF Junior Heavyweight Championship. This belt has one of the strangest lifespans in wrestling history because it technically existed for 20 years, but barely anyone knew it was active for most of that time. The title was created in 1965 to give smaller wrestlers something to compete for, and it actually looked pretty dope. The inaugural champion was a wrestler named Johnny DeFazio, though some records claim it was actually a wrestler named Paul Perez. The championship was quietly retired in 1972 when DeFazio himself retired from wrestling, and for 6 years, the title sat in storage gathering dust. Then, in 1978, WWE decided to revive it as part of a working relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Carlos Jose Estrada won the reactivated title by defeating Tony Garea in January 1978, but almost immediately, the belt was shipped off to Japan. From that point forward, the Junior Heavyweight Championship was primarily defended in New Japan, not in the actual WWF. Japanese wrestlers like Tatsumi Fujinami and the legendary Tiger Mask held this title and made it prestigious within Japan's Junior Heavyweight division. For the vast majority of American wrestling fans, this title didn't exist. It was technically a WWF Championship, but functionally a New Japan Championship. This weird arrangement continued until 1985, when Vince and New Japan ended their working relationship. And just like that, the Junior Heavyweight Championship was deactivated for the second and final time. New Japan moved on and created their own Junior Heavyweight title in 1986, and Vince pretended the title never existed. But speaking of Junior Heavyweight titles, let's jump forward a couple decades to talk about a championship that actually had potential. The Cruiserweight Championship, and I'm talking about the original version from the early to mid-2000s, not the purple disaster that came later, was introduced after WWE bought WCW in 2001. WCW's Cruiserweight division had been one of the few bright spots in that company's dying years, so WWE decided to keep the title and the division alive under their banner. But the problem started almost immediately. Vince never truly understood what made WCW's Cruiserweight division special. In WCW, these smaller wrestlers were given time to have amazing matches that opened shows and got crowds invested. In WWE, cruiserweights were treated like a sideshow attraction, given 5-minute matches on Sunday Night Heat or used as comedy fodder. The championship itself looked pretty good, but a good-looking belt can't save a division that's being actively buried by the company. Wrestlers like Rey Mysterio, Tajiri, and Paul London did everything they could to make the title meaningful, and by 2007, the writing was on the wall. On September 28, 2007, Hornswoggle was stripped of the Cruiserweight title, and the Cruiserweight division's final champion was a comedy character who wasn't even really a wrestler. The original Cruiserweight Championship is now barely remembered, overshadowed by the purple belt that would come years later. But if you want to talk about wasting potential with a championship belt, we need to discuss the strangest and shortest-lived version of an existing title. In 2003, Vince reactivated the US title, and the title actually looked gorgeous. While many wrestlers like Rusev, JBL, and MVP would go on to hold this version of the championship, many fans don't know that John Cena had a custom spinner version of this title when he was champion. Cena held this modified belt for a very short period during his early rise, but even the company seemed to realize immediately that this was a mistake, and reverted back to the previous version after Cena lost the title. But after dropping the belt, Cena would go on to become WWE Champion, and dominate the company for the majority of 2005 to 2010. And if you want to find out who was the most dominant wrestler of every WWE era, check out this video next.